Hello, ladies and gentlewomen, and welcome to Peak Lesbian, an exclusive podcast. I first want to thank all the women who've been listening, sharing, and engaging with the podcast. I really appreciate it. I love seeing comments and feedback. Please continue to share and support the podcast any way you can. Word of mouth is so very important in reaching a wider audience. In the episode today, I have a great chat with Candice Jackson. She's an attorney in private practice on the West Coast, and since 2021, she's worked with groups challenging gender identity ideology and promoting the rights of women and lesbians. If you'd like to support the podcast financially or follow Candice Jackson on X/Twitter, those links will be in the show notes. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I look forward to y'all's feedback. Welcome, Candice. Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Happy to.
So, me and Candice have known each other for a few years now. We both are running the, I guess you would use it at the quote unquote gender critical circles, a gender realist. And she's a lawyer. She's done lots of work over the years, both with protection and talking about Title IX issues, women's issues, lesbian issues. And so give us just a brief introduction and then we'll start off the conversation.
Sure. So Candice Jackson, and I've been in private law practice on the West Coast, Washington State, Oregon, California for 20 years. Got into policymaking around sex discrimination issues and Title IX by going to work in the education department from 2017 to early 2021. So that's where I got the opportunity to really come face to face with the way that gender identity is conflicting with sex in law. For the last 3 or 4 years, I've focused on helping groups with women in prison issues and the way that males are being housed in women's prisons, consulting with a lot of parents about gender identity issues going on in schools. And doing some consulting with situations around public access and single sex space access.
Okay. And when did you get kind of have you always been critical of the trans movement?
I'll be honest, early on, so in the 25-year period where I've been an out lesbian in my life, it took a lot of years for it to catch up to me. It kind of felt like being a boiled frog for a while, looking around our community, our lesbian groups and communities, and wondering all of a sudden. I remember my wife and I turning to each other one time, probably 15 plus years ago, and saying, "Where'd the tea come from again? Like, when did we vote on this? What is this?" So it just gradually kind of crept up on me that this was becoming more and more of an expanded group. I went through a phase of thinking, well, I don't feel like we have a lot in common, LGBT and T, but okay. And then it really, I'll be honest, has only been in the last 6 years or so that it has truly hit me that this isn't just about combining groups that don't have enough in common. This is about trying to combine things that on one side is an orientation issue, an actual characteristic, and on the other side is an ideology that's coming after the very basis for us recognizing our sexual orientation and living in this world as women and as lesbians.
There is a lot of lesbians out there that seem to support this.
Yes, unfortunately.
I like to ask other lesbians their opinion on why. Why do you think lesbians support this so much, or seem to?
Oh, I think it overlaps a lot with why do we see a lot of the gender identity movement being promoted and led by women. I don't think that there is a totally satisfactory answer to that. I think part of it is the general weaponization of female empathy. I think part of it for the younger generations of lesbians who would like to consider themselves feminists or would like to consider themselves part of an LGBT movement, it's been a top-down, there's no choice involved. I mean, you either are a good person and accept LGBTQ everything, or you're a terrible person who might as well be a right-wing Nazi. I mean, that's the only choice that a 25-year-old lesbian has ever been presented in her whole life at this point.
That's very true.
So there's not a lot of choice in a very real sense for at least for the younger generations. The older generations of lesbians who have been around should know better. And that I their support for the gender movement, I have a harder time excusing. I think part of it is going along to get along. I think part of it is we've seen patterns with women in different professions that kind of this pull the ladder up behind you and or be just as hard on other women because hey, you had it hard. So yeah, tougher to explain away older lesbians who have been through the civil rights movement, who have walked through the difference between lesbianism and communities being underground versus finally having the opportunity to be a lot more integrated into society, and then just ripping that rug out from under us.
I think a lot. I think a lot of it has to do with ignorance. I think a lot of lesbians out there just don't know the extent of it. I think most of them live their lives, especially if they're married or coupled up. They're either running a household and they're just not paying attention to what's going on. And then the whole be nice. I really agree with you on the whole weaponization of empathy. You want to be nice, you want to be kind, and I think that especially preys on people who have been treated unkindly, right? And
Yeah,
so lesbians and gay men have been treated very unkindly for a very long time. And I think we are more susceptible to not wanting to be the perpetrators of cruelty.
sure.
Um, how old are you?
46.
46 and I'm 44. So, yes, there is a generational difference too.
Mhm.
Definitely. And that's such a good point that there was no choice given. I mean, these kids grew up on the internet. They grew up on Tumblr. They grew up on all of this stuff. I think we were fortunate to have experienced not that.
Yeah,
So, I've noticed that there's a lot of us in this age range now that I think we're more the folks that are like, "Wait a minute, hold up." You know,
I think that's right. I
we've
think
seen
it,
the
and
before and we've
I
seen
think
the
it should.
after.
That's right. I think it should fall right on our generation, right on our age range to take responsibility for speaking up. As soon as we do realize what's going on, we really shouldn't be quiet because when I think about what it must be like for, a 21-year-old, and I remember what it was like for me at 21, it's really horrifying. I mean, it's to me worse than dealing with the religious right wing brand of homophobia that was present, and that was part of what made it so difficult. Blah blah blah. I would take that any day of the week over what a 21-year-old lesbian is dealing with today. If I had
Same.
shown up at our groups and our parades and started to meet lesbians and then all of a sudden realize that I'm expected to not blink an eye at men with penises being it just how why no.
Yeah, yeah, I know it's mind-boggling. Um, you told me a story once about, your, cruise the cruise story where you realized
Mm.
suddenly, "Wait a minute." Do you remember
Yeah, I
that
mean
story?
that's yeah, the
Do you
yeah,
mind just telling the listeners that story? Because was that a part of your peaking? Like, kind of you're like, "Wait a minute."
yeah, it definitely factored in because for a couple of decades, this travel company, they call themselves Olivia Travel, and I think they started out actually in the maybe 70s as a music label, but it was all lesbian oriented. It was by lesbians for lesbians. So for a couple of decades, they ran a travel company, and you go on cruises or go to a resort or something, and you'd have 1,500, 2,000 lesbians gathered together, and you get to spend a week not feeling like the minority, not feeling bonding and traveling with women and listening to female entertainers and comics and really really good stuff. I think for lesbians who were just kind of out living our lives, but every once in a while it's awfully nice to just be surrounded by all women. Um, and about 10 years ago, when my wife and I wanted to, um, we had kids, and so we hadn't vacationed at all for a long time. I wanted to look into doing that again. Realized that Olivia had just capitulated to LGBTQ. It is uh, puzzling. Now they say that they are for LGBTQ women. I don't even know what that means. What is a what is a Q woman? What is a G woman? I mean, what are we talking about here? So it's no longer a lesbian only company. Men are invited, and just as perniciously, women who are actively trying to deny being women, which just goes so much against the heart and soul of what any kind of pride or community was built up in a lesbian space. Because front and center was recognition of and valuing being a woman, and then of
Yeah.
course adding on onto that a woman who loves women. So to 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 water that down, it makes me very sad because you know a, a vacation company like that is probably geared toward older lesbians, but it just makes me sad that the newer generation of lesbians doesn't even have that to age into. That
Hmm.
there's nowhere to go that is a big group of women that is proudly standing up and saying, this is a space, this is an activity for lesbians only.
Yeah. There's a huge loss of women's spaces,
Yeah.
and I think when women's spaces go, obviously lesbian spaces go as well. Like that's just a given. Like lesbians are going to be the hardest hit when women's spaces and women's
Yeah.
existence is denied. You talked with me a little bit about your work in that realm and what you've done to try to fight back against the disappearing of women's spaces.
Yeah. So probably school environments and prison environments are the areas that I've had the most hands-on activity in, and are perhaps two of the most symbolic. The school environment includes sports, at the K through 12 and collegiate level, and so between um, sports and prisons and general school environment of locker rooms and bathrooms and so forth, it really highlights why female only spaces came up to exist in the first place, and the importance of continuing them. Um,
Because these
Looking
spaces are spaces women can't opt out of really, right?
Absolutely. I mean,
You're
you're in
you
school all day, for example, and when you need to take care of your period or just use the facilities or change for gym or anything, yeah, absolutely. You can't just not do those things. You're going
and
to be
same with
either doing
prison.
them, well, in prison, right? Even
You're
less voluntariness or opting out ability, right? Because you are
yeah.
just locked up and you don't have a say over who you room with and who you're celled up with and what the community showers are like, or anything else. Um, so it's been interesting to me to realize from a legal point of view that, in my view, the women's rights legal battles throughout the latter half of the 20th century, I have come to think did a great job in what they were doing, but overlooked the importance of women only spaces. It's been a little shocking to me to realize over the last 5 years or so that, to be honest, the legal entitlement to single sex spaces is on really shaky legal ground. It's sort of been allowed, but it's never been established as an actual right and an actual need for women. So there's a gap there that we're having to sort of campaign and fight on a legal level in a way that women's rights hasn't had to before. And that's because
Well,
it was so obvious. For
yes,
decades, it was so obvious.
I was gonna say, no one thought about it because it
Right.
was seemed like a no-brainer, like, why would we ever need to think about this?
Yes. Okay. So to me, there are two factors to it. That is one, absolutely. That the need for single sex prisons, for example, was seen as just so obvious. Once around the turn of the or the end of the 19th century, when enough women started being locked up in prison that it became a thing. It was obvious from the beginning that women were going to need to be housed separately from men and rehabilitated differently. Um, Same with public bathrooms and school bathrooms. It was just something that was obviously a good thing to do. And so the law, when laws started protecting, say, students against sex discrimination, the laws made exceptions. That's how Title IX works currently. Is there's an exception for school bathrooms and school sports that allows uh, students to be divided up for those activities based on sex. It's not required though.
Hmm.
And that brings me to my second point. The other reason, though, that single sex spaces hasn't ever been legally focused on in the way that it needs to be is because there was a view among feminists throughout the 20th century that really wanted to downplay sex differences, that really did want to focus on basically equating sex differences with sex stereotypes. And what that does is lead you to demand that laws and policies need to treat women the same. Equality of women and men becomes sameness. And that was needed in a lot of areas, right? I mean, there is no reason to treat men and women differently with respect to university admissions, for example, or can women go to enter into the military academies. I mean, there were plenty of areas where women were excluded based on no good reason except for negative stereotypes. And so equality of treatment was what was needed. But I think there was an unspoken premise among women's rights campaigners um, that sex differences should never be acknowledged legally or taken into account. And that leaves us in a position today of having to go back uh, and disentangle, saying we women need certain things separate and apart from men because there are sex differences that matter to us. Those aren't based on negative stereotypes about women. It truly is uh, and you can see this playing out in sports, by the way. I mean, I've seen some articles come out recently where people are literally saying the only reason why men and women can't compete in sports together is because women haven't had enough resources, or we haven't played mixed sports enough, and so women aren't following male pace setters. I mean, it's getting ridiculous to say there really is a renewed push to erase the concept of differences between male and female in a way that is making it hard to go in and defend a need to separate the sexes, not because women are less than, but because women are different.
Yeah, that was something that when I was a teenager in the 90s, kind of, I guess that was the mainstream messaging of feminism that I got, was that women could be as good as men,
Yeah,
which meant we had to be like men. We had to be able to do everything men could do, and that really leaves girls in a really shitty situation because the reality is we can't do everything men can do physically.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
like, I remember there was a lot of movies and a lot of nonsense around women going to the military and being these badasses, and it's like, physically, no. Physically, there
right,
is going to be a huge difference between what a female can do and what a male can do. That doesn't mean they can't go in the military, but that means we gotta be honest to say, perhaps not every place in the military is going to be the best fit for females.
right.
Because of our physical stuff. Now, maybe we can figure out a way to make it work, but I mean, we have to be honest about it, right? there's also a lot of things that we could say that the female body and the female way of what we're good at or what we're not good at, is actually better than some
Right.
male bodies. Like, I mean, it's okay to say there's differences and there's strengths in both sides, and where do we put that in? But the
Yep.
physical part got hooked up with the intelligence part. Do you know what I mean? We want
Yes.
equality with intelligence and value as humans. That doesn't mean we have to be as physically strong as you to gain that equality.
Yes. That is exactly right. And I grew up with the same message. And I think we were, I think through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we were on a good path toward turning that corner and realizing that what what it meant to send a message to girls that you can do anything and you can be anything. I think we were getting a little more realistic about it, but then we halted that process and in swept this ideology that tells us that sex is not even grounded in material reality. It really is just up to an inner feeling, and there is no difference between male and female, except in the sense that you know apparently a lot of men would like to be female.
So, have you worked on any cases involving detransitioners?
I did a couple of years ago, and an Oregon detransitioner case. I started the lawsuit. I handed it off last year to an Oregon law firm that's taking it and running with it. But it's active, and it's one of the first in Oregon to pursue malpractice against mental health providers.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
What
Which is where I think for detransitioners, I do think that's the linchpin. I mean, I think we're going to see, a wave of malpractice against the surgeons and the prescribing doctors. But to me, the starting point of it needs to be the mental health professionals, because the surgeons and the endocrinologists claim, they just take it they just take the recommendation from a therapist, from a mental health provider, saying this is needed, this is necessary for mental health. And so then the surgeon's only responsibility, presumably, is to carry out the surgical procedure competently, not have to back up and revisit with the patient, is this even necessary? Because they're just taking that medical necessity handed to them.
Yeah, that's something that's frustrated me with a lot of, like, talk and lawsuits is they will focus on the surgeons, and I'm like, "But that's not where it's starting, that's not who gave the okay, it's the mental
Right.
health industry." Well,
Yeah.
industry being the key word there. It's the mental health profession that is
Yes.
giving who's always given this the okay. This is where it
Right.
came from. And so but that's does that is that more challenging, though, to go after the mental health aspect versus the surgeons, or do they treat it the same?
Well, I mean, I think each would have its own challenges and obstacles for sure. I don't think it's any more difficult to focus on going after the mental health professionals. For one thing, a lot of them over the last 5 7 years have turned into mills, right? And so
Mhm.
getting a therapy letter approving you for surgery became something that you can. There is no evaluation going on. It. So even if the mental health professional was holding up, WPATH standards, I follow WPATH. Well, they weren't even really following that. And then, of course, that second layer is you peel that back and realize WPATH standards are not themselves grounded in anything real or evidence based. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's an insurmountable challenge to show that these individual mental health providers were simply not doing their jobs. I mean, there was no individualized assessment going on. There was no, even if you accept gender dysphoria as an appropriate diagnosis, even if you accept that recommended treatment for gender dysphoria needs to be something surgical, even against those premises, there's been such a lack of any individualized evaluation or assessment or checking for comorbidities or differential diagnosis for mental health going on, that I don't think difficult at all. I think it's just a matter of enough lawyers having the willpower to go after these mental health professionals.
I had an attorney tell me that what really needs to happen is the statute of limitation needs to be extended out
Yeah,
because
that
that's
is
the
a
big
huge
issue that
barrier.
so many are running up against right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're seeing some movement on being on state by state being willing to extend that statute of limitations, but that's a huge barrier, right? Because it usually within malpractice situations, state by state, you're looking at anywhere from 1 year to maybe 3 years to come back and say, hey, my medical treatment fell below the standard of care. Now I'm going to sue you. And 1 to 3 years out from a major surgical procedure, let's say, most people are not done dealing with even the physical changes and consequences of it, much less coming to terms internally with any kind of stepping away and thinking, huh, what was this even what was necessary to fix whatever I thought my problems were? I mean, that we're just seeing over and over again that that's a process that, you're talking more like 5, 10, 15 years out is
Yeah.
the kind of coming to terms with it emotionally, mentally, thoughtfully that a lot of people have. So the timelines do not match up very well for tons of detransitioners to be able to go back and sue their providers.
Yeah, California's 1 year.
I mean, it's
It's
just
it's gonna happen in that time.
well, and that's one of the problems with the whole concept of giving surgery to treat an emotional desire. Well, then whether or not that surgery was good or bad, according to the patient, it is also a matter of internal reflection,
Yeah,
right? I mean,
that's totally unscientific too. How do you even,
exactly.
because if you're gonna do a surgical malpractice thing, right? You would have proof that they screwed up the surgery, right? There's a
Right.
physical proof. But if you're doing surgery for a mental condition, how do you prove anything?
Exactly. So yeah, that's exactly right. So usually you would say, well, a surgical procedure was defective or done incompetently because it didn't accomplish its own goal.
Hmm.
If you're going to restore function in your knee surgically, well, you can tell within a year, let's say, usually whether that was a successful or unsuccessful surgery. But here, your whole definition of a successful surgery has nothing to do with whether the surgery was performed competently or achieved its goal. Because let's say if its goal is removing breasts and masculinizing a chest, a detransitioner 5 years later isn't judging that surgery by necessarily by whether there were complications or whether the breast was fully removed or not. It's about whether the surgery was ever even appropriate or needed to help that person in any way. And
Yeah,
that is something that only the detransitioner, only the person, only the patient can ever judge. A doctor can't come look at it, or put it this way, a doctor could come in and look at two exact similar situations where a woman's breasts were removed for gender reasons, and the surgeries turned out exactly the same, no complications. One of those people might be perfectly thrilled with it, and the other is going to say, this was malpractice of you to do this to me. And there's no objective difference except one of the women realizing, you did not change me into a man, and you have now caused me to lose function in a lifelong way, and that just never should have been allowed to happen.
well, I guess that's the problem with when you let the quote unquote patient tell you what the treatment needs to be.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah, and
Which
which
initially
goes
is
right back to the mental health field as well.
yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
problem with affirmation only. Is there's an abdication of the role of the professional to come in and question and tease things apart and help somebody maybe get a different viewpoint on the feelings that they're having.
Yeah. Um, so let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the prison system.
Yes.
What's been
Well,
is that kind of what you're more recently kind of involved with now?
Yes, that's been my current project over the last year or so. I started out working with Wolf, and we have a lawsuit in California against their law that passed in 2021, um, allowing men to choose to be housed in women's prison. I'm also working in Washington State, where there's no state law that allows this, but the prison system got themselves sued by ACLU and Disability Rights Washington a few years ago, and so under a settlement agreement and court enforced protocol, have been just falling over themselves in Washington Department of Corrections to allow as much latitude as possible for men to be transferred over into the women's prison.
So, what can you speak about the lawsuit in California?
Yes, the lawsuit in California is ongoing. Let's see, there was a motion to dismiss that the judge postponed ruling on for 2 years. It finally got ruled on this year.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
Is that normal to postpone for that long?
no, it's not unheard of, but it's not totally normal either. I don't think this judge wanted anything to do with this if she could
I was
help
gonna
it.
say, do you get the sense that a lot of these judges are just like, "Oh shit, push this down the
Yep,
road because I don't want to even address it"?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Wolf had to file an amended complaint after the judge dismissed most of the claims. That amended complaint has now been freshly challenged again by the state with a new motion to dismiss everything. So it's just gonna keep going and going like that. Probably up to having to appeal to the Ninth Circuit, and frankly, at some point, we're going to need the Supreme Court to weigh in on some of this. The clash between um, gender identity and sex-based anything is just it's going to need to be decided probably at the Supreme Court level.
Okay. So, yeah, I want to pick your brain about that because I think you have a lot of really good insight into why there is what the clash is and
Yeah.
why gender ideology does not work in law.
Yeah, it's fascinating to try to step back and figure out what's going on conceptually here. What is the principle or the philosophy going into this? So starting with the philosophy or the principle behind sex discrimination or sex based rights to begin with, the idea would be to say, all right, we recognize that humans come in male and female, and that historically and currently, oftentimes it is women who get negatively or punitively treated just because they're not men. And so non-discrimination laws, have come up, have come into existence to protect the class of women on that immutable characteristic. We didn't do anything to be born female, but we were, and we don't deserve to lose out on rights and opportunities and protections because we happen to be born female. So then along comes the notion of gender identity, and there's no great definition of what gender identity or being transgender is, but whatever it seems to be, it's unavoidably in conflict with the characteristic of sex. And you can make that conclusion just based on anybody who believes in gender identity trying to tell you what it is, right? It's
Yeah.
your internal personal sense of being a boy or a girl. It's your deeply rooted transcendental conviction of knowing that you are male or female or maybe both or maybe neither. However, they, meaning people who believe in gender identity, however they try to describe it, it's clear that it has something to do with sex, because they're not just saying this is about just a personal feeling. They do go that step further and say my personal feeling actually determines or overrides what sex I was born as.
So they're
So
still
there's
recognizing
no
sex.
Yeah, so there's no definition or concept of gender identity that doesn't automatically include um, overriding the characteristic of sex. So what happens in law when you try to say, all right, every time that we talk about sex discrimination or separation of the sexes, we are now also going to talk about not discriminating or separating people based on gender identity. How does that play out? How does that work? Well, take non-discrimination. What they're saying it means is that in a situation where you're not allowed to discriminate based on sex, you're also not allowed to discriminate based on gender identity. You know, it's funny, in a weird way, that would be workable within the law, except the way that they define or insist non-discrimination has to work. They're saying it's discrimination not to honor gender identity. They're not stopping at the point of saying, hey, don't treat somebody negatively just because they say they have a gender identity. That would actually be workable in law, because it would be the equivalent of saying don't punish somebody because they, don't fire somebody because they come to work and tell you that they have an inner conviction about the salvation of their soul. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
They've told you that. They've expressed that belief about themselves. You don't have to agree with it, but you definitely shouldn't fire them because they hold that view about themselves.
Yeah.
If that's the non-discrimination that we were talking about with regard to gender identity, that would be perfectly workable in law, I maintain. The problem is that what all the pro-gender activists are saying is that non-discrimination based on gender identity has to mean validating that gender identity, acting on it, treating that subjective declaration about a person as though it is factual. And as soon as you do that, you're going beyond non-discrimination and into the world legally of proactive accommodation or granting of exceptions, granting of privileges based on something that's purely subjective. So back to the religious analogy, it would be very, very similar to saying, as soon as somebody comes to work and says, I have an immortal soul that has been forgiven by Jesus Christ, well, now you're no longer allowed, let's say, to punish that employee for violating a company rule because that person's forgiven. You see what I'm saying? I mean, they have a subjective view that their soul is forgiven. So you're not allowed to apply general rules to that person anymore due to their subjective belief about themselves. That's what we're talking about with gender identity now. We are saying, because somebody comes to you and says, I have this belief that my inner soul is different and takes precedence over my factual characteristic of my sex. Therefore, you're no longer allowed to apply any sex-based rules to me. Don't categorize me based on my sex. Don't separate me into spaces that are classified by sex. You are not allowed to apply general sex-based rules to me because I have this belief about myself.
Okay. That's a good analogy. That's a good description of it. But you did say that that the law could accommodate the gender belief in gender, belief that you have a gendered soul, let's say.
Belief, absolutely.
But so what's happening now in law, like what I see is they are combining basically it seems like gender is overriding sex. It's basically saying whoever feels like they are this sex fits into this sex category.
Yeah.
Which does away with the category.
That's right.
Because in law, this is my opinion, you can tell me if this is correct, because in law, it has to be based on fact. You cannot make laws based on beliefs. Like, doesn't it have to be something factual?
It really doesn't. I mean, I think, I do some criminal defense sometimes, and it doesn't work out well to make things subjective and say, well, you're charged with driving under the influence, but all somebody has to say is, I don't think I was. I don't feel like I was. I was, no, that's not who I am. Okay, I classify myself as not having violated the law. Law doesn't work that way. No, it is supposed to be based on objective standards and some basic foundational facts of the world are supposed to be a starting point that you don't even have to argue about anymore.
So why has it been the case that all of the gender stuff, the protections for people who believe in gender ideology or who identify as trans, has been pushed in and
Yeah.
shoved with
Yeah.
sex? Because they could accomplish the same protections, couldn't they, if they just had it as separate thing?
No, they can't be. Well, it depends on what they're going after. The problem is that no activist group promoting gender identity that I know of or have seen evidence of is pushing for the kind of basic non-discrimination that I was describing earlier, which would just be saying, don't be punitive to somebody just because they express this belief. Don't refuse to rent them an apartment. Don't fire them from their job. Don't deny them admission to college. Don't kick them off their sports team just because they've announced to the world, I don't think I'm a boy. I think I'm a girl. Announce that all you want without fear of losing civic participation because of it.
Yeah.
But that's not what any group that's advocating for gender identity policies is asking for. They are all asking for going that step further and validating and forcing every system around you to act on the gender identity proclamation as though it is factual. And that's just something we don't do in law. Is well, at least in a secular society, is base our laws and policies on validating and putting into practice the subjective or faith-based beliefs of individuals. We let you believe it, but we don't let your belief infiltrate and be enforced in law.
Give me an example of what they're asking for.
Sure.
Asking for in law,
Yeah.
right? Because most
Right.
people will hear trans rights or human rights or trans rights and go, oh, they just want, they think in the equality sense, but what are they actually asking for? What has actually been happening in law and courts?
That's right. I mean, that if all they were asking for was equal treatment under law, I don't think any of us would be up in arms about it. But what they're asking for is that every time society has set up any kind of rule that involves a sex classification, the demand of gender activists is that sex classification now become a gender classification. So
which means
if we have sex separated sports, the activists want, you can still have your women's team, but you have to allow men onto the women's team based on identity. You can have a women's prison, but you have to put men into the women's prison if they say they're women. You can take a census and ask people what their sex is so that we can track how many men and how many women live in our society. But now we're going to have a census that is based on everybody's self-report of their sex, not their factual sex. So our data collection tracking anything sex-based goes out the window.
I also think of how damaging healthcare can become when you aren't being truthful and honest about sex and what goes on there. I mean, seen it for myself, doctors and files and being very confused about the sex of, well, my sex at some point. And even now coming up against this, like, no, that's not correct, which is dangerous. It's dangerous for them to not understand because there are major sex differences in medication and treatment and what you would give a female versus what you would give a male. And you don't want someone going in there who on every record says they're a male, they treat him as a male and they kill him because they weren't supposed to give him that dose or that medication.
Yep.
Not to mention just overlooking medical issues that a woman could have that a man wouldn't have. I've heard stories of that.
Yep.
There's just so much to be lost by not being truthful.
Yeah, I mean that's right. That's exactly what it comes down to. There are a lot of repercussions in society to not being truthful in a basic factual way. Take identity cards, driver's licenses, birth certificates, passports. If the ask of gender activists was, please add a gender marker, keep the sex marker, but please add a gender marker so that everybody you show ID to or whatever can choose to be respectful of saying in a interpersonal, casual way, Miss instead of Mr. It's an
Yeah.
ask. It's not a legal requirement, but it would help us out. If that's what was being asked, that probably wouldn't have caused a ton of ripples. It's the falsification of a sex marker on a legal document that opens the door to all these problems.
Absolutely. I think that so okay, so this goes back to I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. I'm going to
Yeah.
play the other side. Um well, what's people just want to live their lives. What's wrong with just letting these people live their lives? They're not hurting anyone. That's the big
Yeah.
argument.
No, it is, and it's put that way in part to capitalize on the way that was the refrain that resonated with a lot of people over 20 or 30 years in the fight for gay acceptance, for acceptance of homosexuals. Just let us be, let us walk around with the same sex partner, and we just want to go to work. Also, we just want to live our lives. Let us adopt kids, let us raise our kids and send them to your schools
Let me
without
visit my wife in the hospital. Let me have say
exactly
over
without
her.
being that's right. If that was what was being requested, nobody would have a problem with it. Unfortunately, what just let me live my life means in trans world has become, let me determine how I want to be classified factually as male or female. And there are just too many conflicts with that. That is not just living your life; that is impacting the lives of everybody else: women,
Yeah.
children, lesbians, the medical system, etc.
So really, what are the harms of letting a few guys who identify as
Yeah.
women into women's spaces and or into women's prisons? Or I mean, there's so few of them. It's not that big a deal. And
Yeah, you're right. That's a next argument. Is we're just talking about helping out a tiny number of people. So first of all, you got to point out there is no limitation on the group who can fit into the group called transgender or called accommodating your gender identity, because it is open to everybody. It's open to every single person at any given time, because all it requires is a declaration from yourself saying, this is how I feel about myself, and that opens the door to get you those exceptions.
yeah, you don't
So there
have to
is
have
no
any
limitation.
surgery, folks. No surgery,
Oh, you
no
don't have to be on
nothing.
hormones. You don't have to have
No.
surgery. No law that I'm aware of that has put gender identity into law in the US has insisted on any kind of proof, on any kind of standard, on any kind of, well, here are the hoops that you got to jump through. I mean, that's not true. I mean, there are some state laws that require some hoops before you can get documents changed. But the big laws that make big impacts in terms of playing on cross-sex sports teams or going into the opposite sex prison, for example, are very careful not to put any requirements on it. So there is no limitation whatsoever on which males get to say, hey, put me into the women's category. And then we now have a good decade of numbers in these different areas to track, realizing that we're not talking about tiny numbers. We're talking about significant numbers. And then the other argument against this is that by definition, a space does not stay single sex if the opposite sex is let in even once. By
Yeah.
definition, you have lost a women's space by the presence of a male. And in some circumstances, that's going to matter more than others. A guy who passes on casual interaction as a woman coming into a public restroom may or may not cause any problem ever. However, one male in a rape crisis group might cause a huge ripple effect and disruption to the very purpose of healing and recuperation for that group of women. And same with the prison. I will be straightforward about this. From all of the work on prisons that I have done, letting in a very, very small number of men who have had bottom surgery, who are post-op, classify themselves as post-op trans women. That's been going on for a couple of decades at least in prisons, where a small number have been placed like that here and there. And the women in prison that I have talked to, by far and large, in fact, almost without exception that I can think of, didn't have a problem with it. So in the prison situation, it's true that one or two or three or four in a women's prison post-op didn't cause problems for women overall.
Why do you think that is?
For one, it was such a small number. For another thing, women weren't living in daily apprehension of functioning penises. It does make a difference to them whether the male body that they are on a bunk with is intact or castrated. That does make a difference in terms of physically feeling comfortable and the apprehension of any kind of sexual interaction, potential for STDs, pregnancy, rape, things like that. So it does make a difference to them on a practical level. Mm-hmm. Conceptually, is it justifiable? Not really. But I will say on a practical level, that is one area where. But here's the problem: no prison system that I'm aware of today is willing to make that kind of castration or surgery to get rid of penises a requirement. They're just not willing to do it. So even that level of protection for women in prison is not even on the table.
Do you know what I used to hear in the trans community when I was in there, when these arguments would come up? Women rape too.
Yeah. Yep. We're hearing that. That's a great one, right? Where, hey, there are male guards, and sometimes women, get abused by the male guards. So, hey, it already is happening to women. And yes, same thing. Well, women can sexually assault each other too. And that happens in prison too.
Yeah.
That to me is, that argument is even said in a serious way, speaks for me to I guess a total neglect or letting go of the concept of safeguarding and risk reduction. We don't make rules that are intended to reduce harm and risk. We don't make those rules only if there's somehow a guarantee that this rule will now eliminate every single possibility of a type of harm. We make proactive safeguarding rules so that risks and harms will be severely reduced and avoided. But it's not dependent on whether we can eliminate it altogether. And the answer to some of that, like with rapes in prison or sexual assaults of women by women or of women by male guards, the answer isn't, so a little more risk, who cares? The answer is, oh, well, then of course we need to pay more attention to reduce those existing categories of harm.
Don't add to it.
That's right.
But also, I think a lot of this is also going back to denial of male violence. And I think this is happening from everybody. Just the denial of the fact that men and boys too, for the most part, are the individuals carrying out sexual and violent acts against females and women.
Yeah.
I mean, I can understand why women want to deny this, and we understand why men want to deny this.
Yeah.
Do you think that's also playing a huge role in this?
Yeah, I think, and then the corollary of that denial is the denial that men who identify themselves as women don't statistically carry out the pattern of male violence that any other male would. And you put those two things together, and you're seeing a reluctance to get back to acknowledging that, crime statistics is one of the sort of broadest and deepest areas of data we have ever had. showing stark sex differences. And you're right, we're just losing awareness of the importance of that. And of course, we're now, for the last decade or so, doing our best to dilute and ruin that solid database of sex based evidence in the crime world by recording crimes now based on gender identity instead of sex. So it doesn't take a lot because there's such a huge difference. If it was, let's say in some areas, let's say it's 98% of X type of violent or sexual crimes are committed by males. It doesn't take a whole lot of males being recorded as female perpetrators to really screw with that statistic and all of a sudden make it look closer and closer to, hey, there's not as much of a difference as we thought. Everybody commits some crimes now and again. We don't need to pay attention to crime problems based on sex anymore.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's again, it's a denial of what we know. It's a denial of trying to base our decisions and lawmaking on facts and what we know and not basically religious beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we in the United States, and I think in most of the Western world, we've come to the point where we're like, "Oh, it's probably a good idea to try to keep, religion out of, state and law," right? Because there's
Yeah.
so many people who believe so many things. It's just a mess if you try to bring that in.
Yeah.
How do we make laws to best help and cover everybody without interfering? And this is just a religious belief, and it's just, it's
Yeah.
taken over law, in my opinion. It's taken over our whole society. The core is denial of sex. That's the core issue is the denial of sex, and that is just it's especially it's devastating to everybody. But I think about because I focus on lesbians, I think about just how devastating that's also been for our community. Before we kind of sum up here, I did want to talk just a little bit about you know your opinion on what you've seen, maybe what you've seen over the years, what your experience has been, and just your opinion on how this ideology has affected lesbians and impacted lesbians and lesbian community in particular.
Yeah. Well, starting at the the current where we're at now, it is very sad to me to see what I view as a backlash or resurgence of old-fashioned homophobia coming to the surface. I'm seeing that all over right now. Just basically, people who have held this view for a long time, but maybe went a little underground with it, feeling very emboldened now to come back up and say, "Hey, I told you." As soon as we started letting those gays in, and as soon as we let them marry and stuff, look at all the craziness that's happening, and it's all their fault. I mean, it's the chaos and antisocial impacts of gender ideology is having just an inescapable negative backlash impact on just ordinary gays and lesbians who have spent the last decade, 2 decades starting to feel relatively safe and comfortable moving around in society with same-sex partners.
Mhm.
Um and and that's starting to go out the window in terms of impact on gays and lesbians. I think I think we now have to battle that perception that's coming back up from the right, and we're having to battle from the left, because it is from the left that this gender identity stuff has come from. Just a new form of homophobia and denial of sexual orientation, and denial that there's any kind of benefit or value in lesbian spaces or communities, or any right at all just to acknowledge ourselves as our own distinct group, our own distinct class. And that's coming at us from the side that was supposedly on our side for the last 20 years. So it's very discouraging. And um, I would think, especially again for younger homosexual people, it's got to feel just overwhelmingly confusing.
Yeah, I've heard stories from a few stories from the young ones. I'm talking, even still in high school or just out of high
Mm,
school that just feel totally lost because they don't have community really
yeah,
unless they go along with all of this stuff, but they feel lost because, to be honest, I remember what it was like to be a young woman who just came out. I wanted to find a girlfriend. I wanted to have sex.
right,
Like, I wanted to find a
right.
woman. Let's be honest. And if you're going around a bunch of people who are denying
Yep,
same-sex attraction and denying that even
yep,
you can telling you, "Oh no, you can't say you only want a woman. You can't say you only want a female body."
yep.
That is so messed up.
It is messed up. It's so messed up. Yeah. What do you mean I'm same gender attracted? What does that even mean? I mean, you're still trying to figure out and come to terms with being such a minority in society that
Right?
it's difficult enough to come to grips with what it means to be a female, sexually and romantically attracted to females. That's hard enough, and now you're being told by what is supposed to be your community that none of that is actually real. What's real is looking to people's genders and identities, and it just I
Yeah,
it's not.
you're supposed to be attracted to the way someone, quote unquote expresses
Oh,
themselves. Well, that
oh,
you can, but that doesn't override sex.
that's right. That's right. You can that's right. It wouldn't that's not what would define your sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it's crazy. So thank you so much for talking with me. This has been really insightful. We maybe we'll have another conversation down the road too, just because I love like I think you're super intelligent. I love the way you put things. Yeah, I know you've spoken out with LGBT Alliance USA on the Title IX thing, and you just had so many good points to say there that I'm just like, she put it perfectly.
Oh, well, you are too kind. I have absolutely treasured following your journey and getting to know you over the last few years. And again, I'm so glad that you're doing this new podcast. I think it is such a needed space to fill for space for lesbians to talk about impacts on our community. I think it's terrific.
Thank you.